started as a replacement for the postponed in-person National Model Railroad Association's Northeastern Region Convention in 2020 due to COVID. With its success, it became a springtime annual event. Today, NERx is the Northeastern Region's annual virtual convention jointly produced by the Northeastern Region and NMRA teams. While NERx features clinics and layout tours similar to what you will find at its annual in-person fall convention, its producers are working to find ways to offer unique segments that distinguish it from the in-person fall convention. NERx will be broadcast on the NMRA YouTube channel on the date and time shown, and everyone is invited to watch. NERx showcases what is happening in the NMRA's Northeastern region and sharing it with the model railroad community. So let's take a deeper dive into what NERx is. At a typical in-person convention, the layouts you see are owned by members of the host division or located near the convention hotel. But with a virtual convention, you get to see a sampling of layouts from all corners of the region. With the Northeastern region covering a part of Pennsylvania, northern New Jersey, New England, eastern Canada, Quebec, and most of New York, there are nearly 1,500 members within its borders. That means there are a lot of layouts out there, and we are working hard to get them seen on NERx. You will see layouts based on prototypes, freelanced, or somewhere in between. They'll feature a variety of scales, gauges, locales, and state of completion. And of course, we have clinics. Like layout tours, clinics are one of the activities found at a typical in-person convention. The National Model Railroad Association is a nonprofit organization, and the cornerstone of its nonprofit eligibility is the education it provides to model railroaders. One of the ways it accomplishes this is through clinics at conventions and other NMRA events. These clinics can be on a variety of model railroading topics. Clinic presentations on railroad history, the latest technologies such as 3D printing, laser cutting, DCC and LCC, scenery, model building, operations, layout design, and more are found at these events. During NERx, clinics are in the program. The clinics are pre-recorded, 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a live Q&A session with the clinician. So if you have a question for the clinician, enter it in the chat on YouTube during the live stream. Tips and tricks are a scaled-down version of a clinic focused on one tip shared with the viewer. It can be about modeling, electronics, operations, or any other model railroading tip explained in 5 to 15 minutes. The tips and tricks are pre-recorded for NERx too. We use these tips and tricks to fill space between the other great activities during NERx. We will also show the work of our members in between clinics and layout tours. This is not a contest. There is no paperwork, there is no judgment, there are no awards. There is only a sense of pride when our members share their work that may inspire other model railroaders. This is the Model Showcase, a popular regular feature of NERx. Locomotives, scenery, cars, structures, and anything else model railroading are what you will see during the Model Showcase. The entries may be in process or complete, in any scale, gauge, or prototype photograph. One of the unique segments offered during NERx is a nightly roundtable discussion. These discussions bring together a handful of subject matter experts with a moderator to discuss a specific subject. In addition to the Q&A segments after a clinic presentation, this is the only other segment of NERx that is live instead of pre-recorded. Past topics have included layout command control, or LCC, social media's impact on the hobby, women in model railroading, engaging families in the hobby, and deeper dives into model scales other than HO. This year, we plan to continue bringing interesting discussions. Be sure to support our NERx sponsors, just as they have supported us. Every night features a drawing for 2 separate $50 gift vouchers from our sponsors. You need to enter every night to participate. Look for the link in the YouTube live feed description to register. Registration for each night's drawing will close at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, with the drawing occurring at 10 p.m. So tune in to see if you win. You can also donate to keep programs like NERx going. Go to nerx.org and scroll down to the Donate button to make your donation with a credit card, debit card, or PayPal account. and that is NERx. Here is a reminder of a few things from the presentation. Remember to watch on the NMRA YouTube channel on the date and time shown here. Remember to enter each night's drawing for one of two $50 gift vouchers from our sponsors. And remember to patronize our sponsors. You can keep up to date on what is happening with NERx by visiting the website at nerx.org. Be sure to make tracks for NERx.
Good evening. Welcome to NERx for 2025. Glad that you could join us. NERx is sponsored by the Northeastern region of the National Model Railroad Association. We have a whole bunch of stuff going on tonight for you, and we hope that you'll enjoy it and come back and check with us the next 3 nights as well. I'm Ed O'Rourke. I'm the president of the NER, and I'll be your host for the evening. NERx is sponsored by Mini Prints, Interaction Hobbies, Mind Models, and Tony's Train Exchange. Every night is a brand new drawing for 2 separate $50 gift vouchers from one of these sponsors. This means that you need to enter every night that you want to participate. The drawing will be held at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Tonight, Mind Models is our featured sponsor, and Ron Clace will be joining us to pull the winners of the drawing. To enter tonight's drawing, go to www.surveymonkey.com and enter your name and email address to register. We'll post that link in the chat a little bit later. Registrations for tonight's drawing will close at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, and the drawing will be at 10. Stay tuned to see if you win. We also want to thank the Around the Layout podcast for sponsoring NERx, and they have been very busy spreading the word about this year's event. So thank you to Ray Arnott and his team. They release a new podcast every Tuesday, so check them out wherever you listen to your podcasts. NERx is brought to you free of charge by the NER. If you'd like to help us out and keep these things going, you can make a donation to help programs like NERx. Just go to nerx.org and scroll down to the donate button. Now we're going to get started on our first clinic for the evening, be presented by Greg Williams. Greg is president of the Eastern Canada Division. His modeling interests are the Canadian Pacific and Western New Brunswick. Greg has training as an electronic technician, and his father was a technician for Northern Electric in Montreal. Greg's father taught him to solder as a young teen, and he has practiced that skill for over 40 years. But we won't do the math on that, I guess, Greg. So without further ado, here is Greg Williams, soldering tips, tricks, and techniques.
Thanks very much, Ed. The clinic is pre-recorded, so I guess if we could roll tape, we are ready to go. Hello, my name's Greg Williams. I am the current president of the Eastern Canada Division of the NMRA. Today, I'd like to share with you some soldering tips, tricks, and techniques, or as our friends over the pond say, soldering. First off, a quick tip on how not to hold your soldering iron. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of humor. So let's get into it. What exactly is solder? Solder is an alloy of lead and tin, most commonly. And because of the magic of chemistry, the combination of these two metals into an alloy have a lower melting point than they do apart. The melting point of lead is 620 Fahrenheit and tin is 450. But if we combine them in the ratio of 63:37, it melts at 361 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, for reasons that do not matter to us in this presentation, we normally use the ratio of 60-40 solder. Now, how exactly does solder work? It's not simply melting a metal onto 2 other metals. When solder melts on copper, there is what we call a wetting action. What happens is the molecules of the alloy solder merge with the molecules of copper to form a new alloy. You can see that in the illustration to the right. On the top, we have solder, and then we have the intermetallic layer where the solder molecules are mixing with the copper molecules, and at the bottom, we have the copper pad. Without this wetting action, soldering has not occurred. There will be a joint, but not a good one. You might as well use glue. Now, what we have to remember while we're doing that is all metals oxidize constantly. And although the surfaces to be soldered may look clean, bright, and shiny, there is always a thin film of oxide covering it. For a good solder bond to happen, surface oxide must be removed during the soldering process. And for that, we use something called flux. Now, heating metals also causes oxidation to happen even more rapidly. And in order to remove that, flux is used. Now, the flux action is very corrosive at the temperature that solder melts. This removes the oxidation, allowing the solder to flow to get that wetting action and create the molecular bond. In its unheated state, rosin flux is non-corrosive and non-conductive, and therefore it does not affect the circuitry or anything that we are soldering. An important thing to remember is when we're doing electronic soldering, we always use rosin flux. I'll talk more about flux in a little while. Rosin flux melts below the temperature of the solder, removes the oxide, and allows the solder to flow. Rosin flux, the kind we use for electronics, comes in either a paste or liquid form. Most electronic solder is rosin core, which means the alloy, the 6040 tin lead alloy that we're using, has a core inside of it that contains rosin. As solder is brought up to the heated temperature to melt, the rosin melts first, removes the oxides, and allows the solder to flow, and we get the wetting action. The majority of board soldering does not require extra flux. Here's two examples of flux by MG Chemicals. They are a known and trusted brand of soldering chemicals and solder and various things that are used in electronics. On the left, you see the rosin flux in a liquid state, and on the right, in a paste. Either one works perfectly well, works exactly the same way, and is a matter of personal preference. Let's talk about the soldering iron for a minute, because there's a lot of myths surrounding that. First of all, wattage. Any iron between 30 to 60 watts is more than enough for any soldering that we're going to encounter in model railroading. What's more important than the wattage is the tip temperature. A 20-watt iron or a 60-watt iron both reach a temperature capable of soldering. What the wattage means is it allows the tip to recover faster and also heat a larger area. Doesn't have to be an expensive iron, but don't cheap out. You can go to the dollar store and buy a soldering iron for $8. Don't do that. You get exactly what you paid for. If you go with something like a soldering station, you've got a tool that'll last you a lifetime. Let's go through a few examples of irons that I think would be suitable for model railroad purposes. Soldering iron. This is the standard kind of soldering iron that you simply plug into the wall. This is a Weller 30-watt, 120-volt soldering iron kit. It comes with everything that you see in the picture. The iron, a plastic soldering tool, a little bit of solder, and two extra different shaped tips. This is readily obtainable at Home Depot in Canada for just a little over $40. The next step up would be a simple soldering station. The great advantage of this is it allows us to vary the temperature by varying the wattage. Now, this is a questionable feature, and really you're not that much farther ahead than you are with the iron that simply plugs into the wall. It is a little more expensive, You can get one on Amazon for about $75. And here's the Cadillac, the Weller Digital Soldering Station. As you can see on Amazon, this goes for about $167. Less than $200. You can set the temperature exactly digitally. It has a digital output display. Tips are interchangeable. I'll talk more about tips in a little while. And this is the kind of tool that you buy once and you will have forever, hand down to your children and grandchildren. This is another alternative. Now, I'm a bit old school when it comes to soldering. I learned how to solder in the 70s, and I did it as a career starting in the early 90s. And this is the soldering station that I am most accustomed to. It is not digital. It is, however, temperature controlled. It uses a very ingenious and easy, simple technique to control the temperature. It uses a magnet inside the iron, and the tips have a magnet in them. Now, when magnet heats up, it loses its magnetism, and therefore a simple switch turns the tip of the iron on and off to maintain a temperature. You can find these on eBay used for about $100. The advantage is it's a 50-year-old design, parts are still available from Weller, and really, there's not a lot to go wrong with these. I've had one of these since the early 90s. I use it all the time. It has never failed. When I was soldering as part of my job, we had these on our workbenches. They were turned on 6 days a week from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. The only time I ever turned mine off was to change the tip. Now, of course, Weller isn't the only brand out there. It's the brand that I'm familiar with and I trust. Hakko is another brand that is very, very good. Again, in this example, it's a digital display, so you can set the temperature. However, I would warn you to avoid Chinese knockoffs. Most knockoffs that you can get out of China look like Hakko or Weller. I wonder why. And of course, always, your mileage may vary. I know people who have bought irons from China. They're the knockoff brands. They work perfectly fine. It's all a matter of your personal choice. Let's talk about temperature for a minute. It all depends on what you're soldering. For through-hole components on a board and wires up to, I'd say, 22 AWG, 700 degrees Fahrenheit is perfect. If you're soldering larger wires, you might consider something like an 800 degree Fahrenheit. So what do the watts matter? The wattage of an iron will determine how fast the tip can recover. This also relates to the tip size. Think of it this way. You've got a hot iron in your hand. You press it up against two other metals. If there are large metals, such as large wire or code 100 rail, that metal is going to draw heat from the iron and lower the temperature. If it's a low wattage iron, it can't bring the temperature back up fast enough to get good solder melting, to get good flux melting, and to give you a good wet joint. If you use a higher wattage, that is going to recover that much faster. I'll show you in a little while why the 800 degree Fahrenheit tip is very useful. First, tip sizes. Now these are the common Weller tips. They're one model of tip. They have different tip models for different irons. And you can see at the top we have a conical, then what they call the screwdriver tip, and there's other various types of tips. The most useful to us is the one on the bottom, the long conical tip, the screwdriver tip, and the short conical tip. And of course, the larger the tip, the more watts you want to keep it at the temperature that you want for soldering. Of course, you need to keep the tip clean. There's a lot of opinions about this. However, never use abrasives. Some people will say, oh, I use steel wool or just a little bit of sandpaper. Never, ever do that. The tip of a soldering iron has a coating on it to prevent oxidation. And when you use an abrasive, you remove that and ruin the tip. Always use a damp sponge or what we call brass wool. The brass wool will not is not abrasive enough to affect the coating on the tip. Now, of course, the damp sponge draws heat away and cools the tip, so many people prefer the brass wool. Every time you use the iron, clean it and tin it. And I don't mean when you first use it. Every time you make a solder joint, clean it and tin it. You can use what they call a tin pot, and all that is a pot of solder that you dip your iron into. Or you can just put a little from the wire solder in your hand. Remember, if a tip gets damaged, don't try to use it. You're only going to frustrate yourself. Replace it. They're cheap. Few notes on safety. Wear eye protection. When the flux melts, it lets off toxic fumes and smoke. These can get in your eyes and burn them. Also, there's the chance of a little bit of solder splash, hot metal. You don't want that in your eyes. Don't breathe in the fumes. You can get a fume extractor for your workbench. Takes care of that nicely. Always wash your hands. You're handling a material that contains lead. Always wash your hands. And of course, the tip is hot. Don't touch. I guarantee you will, and it'll teach you real quick. Wire gauge. I mentioned this earlier. At the top, we have 14 AWG on down to 30 AWG. Now, this is stranded wire. It has its uses because it's flexible. Here we see a comparison between solid core wire and stranded wire. Again, both have their uses, stranded wire being more flexible. So if you're using it in a situation where things will be moving, use stranded wire. If something's solid and not moving, use solid wire. So what size and type wire do I actually need? Essentially, any gauge of wire will handle any voltage within reason. The determining factor is the current or amperage that goes through the wire. The higher the gauge and the longer the run will result in a greater voltage loss. A thin, long wire is basically a resistor. So common wire sizes that we use, 28 to 32 AWG is used in DCC decoder wiring. The runs are extremely short, a couple of inches at the most, and can handle the current that we need. If you're running a bus on a large layout, you want to use 14. If it's a smaller layout, you might be able to get away with 18. And for track feeders, anything between 18 to 24 will work, all depending on how far your feeder is from the track bus. And stranded or solid, as you prefer. I'd like to talk a minute about through-hole board soldering. Here's an illustration. The blue is the substrate of the board. The yellow rectangles going around the blue are the copper pad. And of course, the yellow thing sticking up is the wire. And we see what we want to have for a solder joint. We want the solder to be smooth, shiny, and a bit concave. That's the perfect solder joint. And if it's wet, we have a joint that will not fail. Let's have a look at some solder joints that are good and bad. On the far left, we see a cold joint without proper wetting. You can see how it's balled up. It's gotten around the wire, but it hasn't flowed onto the pad. A solder joint that is sort of rough and bumpy is called a cold joint. Usually happens when the wire moves before the solder can properly come down and become a solid again. The next one, we don't have wetting on the pin or the pad. Basically, we just have a ball of solder there. You might as well just put some hot glue on it. Then we have insufficient wetting on the pad. It's again around the wire, but it has not made a connection to the pad. Next, we see probably the perfect joint. You can see the conical shape. You can see that it's shiny, and all surfaces have been properly wetted. Next, we have too much solder. Now, that's not really going to make too much of a difference, but it's not proper procedure. The next one is okay as well, a little more than the first one, but again, it still has that triangle shape. And again, on the right, we have too much solder. I want to show you a couple of videos, and there's no audio with these. And this shows some proper techniques for board soldering. There's no audio, but I will narrate as we go. And please excuse my shaky hands. As I get older, my hands shake. So here we have a typical board with components sticking through from the other side. Now, as we go through this, you'll see that I put the iron right on the joint between the base and the wire of the component. I allow it to heat up for a second, and I apply solder. And once you've done this a few times, you will see the wetting action take place. Now, the smoke that you see, I'll show you another one. The smoke that you see is not from the solder itself. That is the flux flashing off. And there we go. And you can see the conical shape. And once you get this technique down, you can see how quickly soldering goes. A board like this would only take a few minutes to completely solder up. And again, anybody can do this. It's a matter of practice, practice, practice. Now you'll see at the top and bottom, I have larger pads with larger legs from the components sticking through. So now I have to make sure that I apply heat long enough to get that whole pad covered. You see, I had to go back there, but there's nothing wrong with that. You want to make sure you have enough solder, but not too much. And it's easier to add a little bit than it is to remove, although we will talk about removing solder. Now you can see easily that it takes a little longer and a little more heat to sufficiently heat the pad to get the solder wet and flowing. So that's board soldering. What about if we had to splice two wires together? Well, this is the famous Western Union splice. You would do this in the field if you want to create a splice that will never come apart and will be reliable for many, many years. The key to this is that there is a mechanical connection. You can see the way the wires are twisted, that mechanically they're secure. We're not relying on the solder for a mechanical connection, only for an electrical connection. So why do I need to do a wire-to-wire splice? There's many reasons for doing this. You may have got a wired decoder that you need to add wires to. You may be working on pickup wires that are already in place, motor wires that are already in place, wires for speakers or lighting. You might just need to extend a lead. Now, with our very small gauge wire, it is very difficult to get the Western Union splice. So most often I resort to a simple splice, mostly because I don't need to rely on it for a mechanical connection. We don't have a lot of mechanical forces in our locomotives that would require it. So let me show you a few techniques for splicing wires. So what I have here is two helping hands, I guess you would call it. And I have two 22 gauge wires. Now the first thing I'm going to do is tin the end of the wire. You can see that this is copper wire. There's no tinning. You can buy wire that's already tinned. So the first thing I do is I tin the wires, and then using the helping hands, I place them so that they are parallel and touching each other. Then I come in again with the solder and soldering iron to complete the joint. Never, ever, ever put solder on your soldering iron and then bring it to the joint, except for one exception, which I will show. And you can see that this is a very shiny joint and is quite strong, but you cannot rely on it mechanically. Now this wire is stranded wire. Can be a little more difficult. Also, it's much finer than 22 gauge. And I'll show you my technique. That what you're seeing at the bottom is simply a piece of tile left over from a project. So what I'm doing here to the wire is after I've stripped it, I hold on to the wire and give it a twist. This twists the wire together to keep things neat and tidy. I place them on the ceramic tile and hold them down just with a couple of pieces of painter's tape. And they are parallel and touching. And then just with a quick bit of solder, they are joined. And you can see the residual flux. That's that yellowish liquid that's below there. And you can see that's a good shiny joint, nice and strong, won't come apart. And of course, I would cover that if I was doing this within a locomotive for a decoder installation. I would cover that with a little bit of heat shrink. Now, I said never put the solder on the tip of the iron and then bring it to the wire. Sometimes you can't have both wires held securely parallel. So in this case, I have one wire on the right-hand side that is secure. And I'm going to form a splice with another piece of wire that I have to hold in my hand. So what you're seeing me do now is get a little bit of flux. And I'm going to use this liquid flux on both pieces of wire. And then I am going to hold them parallel, put a little bit of solder on the tip of my iron, and then bring it to the joint. Now, the reason why we never put solder on the end of the iron and then try to make a joint is because as soon as we do that, we've burnt off all the flux. So in this case, I simply add a little bit of flux, and I don't have to worry about the flux core of the solder. Soldering rail joiners. Why? Well, for smooth curves with flex track, a soldered rail joint is essential. Now, always leave some expansion joints when you're doing a larger layout. That's because the rail doesn't change size with temperature, but lumber does. For short section, a soldered rail joint is easier than putting in another feeder. What you want for this is high heat. You want to get in and out as quick as possible so you don't melt ties. And of course, flux is essential here. Now, this is where the heat comes in. I want a lot of heat so I can get in there, bring the rail and the wire up to temperature, get my solder in, and then get out as fast as possible. That's how you don't melt ties. Many people believe I need a lower temperature in order to prevent melted ties. That doesn't do much for you because at the temperature that solder melts, plastic does even before that. So the only way to prevent this is to get in and out as quick as possible. Many people use wet rags or Kleenex or paper towel to draw away the heat so that the ties aren't melted. You can do that, and it's perfectly good, but that's an extra step that I don't think is actually needed. Let me show you. So here I simply have two pieces of flex track that I want to solder the rail joiner. And you can see with a micro brush, I'm just applying a little bit of flux to both sides. Now, liquid flux isn't watery, but it's a little thick, but it's thin enough to flow into the joint of the rail joiner. That's important because where the flux is, the solder will flow and have that wetting action. So I've applied a little bit of flux, and now I'm going to come in with my 800-degree soldering tip and a larger tip. As you see, I don't want a tiny little tip. And I simply go to the joint and the solder will flow in. Now you see how it's flowed right into the joint. There's no excess solder showing. You can do it on the other side. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And again at the top. Now you can see at the very beginning that solder is balling up. That means it's not hot enough yet. But once it reaches the proper temperature, the solder will flow into where the flux is. And you can see on either side of this, I haven't melted either tie. Now, after I've done this, I will come in with a wire brush and I will clean it up, getting rid of the excess flux. You may see a little bit of solder on the top of the rail. And again, a quick stroke with a file will remove that completely. And as you can see, there's no excess solder there. There's no globs of solder. It's all in the joint. Now, soldering feeders to rail. We all have to do that, whether you've got a DCC layout or a DC layout. Pre-wired rail joiners are available, but they are costly, and there are many places you won't be able to use a pre-wired rail joiner. And of course, this will prevent dead spots on your layout. I'm going to show you two different methods of soldering feeders. Now, this first method, you can see how I shape the solid wire. Here I'm using 20 gauge solid pre-tinned wire. And you can see where I fold it over and then put a little jog in it. So as I put that through the feeder hole in my sub-road bed, the wire can lay right up against the base of the rail. Now, it can be a little tricky to get that to do that, but you'll see here as I push this through that I have to move the wire around in order to get it to lay flat against the base of the rail. You can use a pair of pliers, the tip of a screwdriver, the tip of a file. And as you can see, this one's giving me a little bit of trouble, but eventually I get it to where I'm happy. So you can see how that lays right against the base of the rail. Now again, I'm going to come in with a little bit of flux, apply that. And then come in with my solder and soldering. Apply heat, apply solder, wait for it to reach temperature, and it flows in. Now you see there wasn't a lot of solder there, and I didn't melt the ties or the spike head detail on either side. I'm going to show you another one real quickly. And again, it's going to take you a few of these before you become proficient. I suggest doing exactly what I have here, set up a little test on your bench, practice, do maybe a half a dozen or a dozen, and then when you go to your layout, you'll know exactly what you're doing and you will have no trouble whatsoever. That's exactly how I learned to solder. My father set up a little jig on the workbench, showed me what to do, and he says, here, go at it. Came back a half an hour later to see how I had done. Now, once again, we want to clean up that excess flux. And I use a wire brush to do that. So now here's the other technique that I use. And Andy Sperandio from Model Railroader Magazine showed this. I simply put a bend in the wire, and then I move the wire and crush it. Now this is simply copper wire, so it's very soft. And you can see how that flattens it. And then I come in with a pair of clippers, and I clip that off. And now I have an approximate representation of a spike head. Now, if you're using rail that's finer than Code 100 Atlas Flex Track, you can use a finer wire and get an even smaller spike head. Once again, I want to make sure that that wire is flat up against the base of the rail. Here, I'm just using a little file to move it into final position. It doesn't have to be square on, as long as there's a connection between the rail and the wire. Once again, we come in with flux. Now, again, I'm using flux simply because this is such a large connection that the flux that's in the solder is not quite enough. And I want that solder to flow. And there we go. It's flowed. I'm not exactly happy with this particular one. But again, because I'm going in and out so quickly, I'm still not melting the ties or the spike head. None of that plastic is melted. And when I come in with the wire brush, you can see that that is a very small joint. There's not a lot of solder there. If you paint your track, this will virtually disappear. You can even solder feeders on the inside of the rail. If you're up against a backdrop or the back of your layout and can't get around to solder the feeder on the outside of the rail, by using this technique, you can solder feeders on the inside of the rail. I'm very happy with that joint, how it went, how quickly it flowed. Now, again, I come in with my wire brush, I clean it up, and you can see that that joint doesn't go anywhere near the railhead. It will not interfere with the wheels of locomotives or cars. And here I am using the flange gauge on the NMRA gauge to show that there is no obstruction whatsoever. One last time, I'm going to show you how I do this spike head. Andy Sperandio even does it through the plastic tie. He removes the cast-on spike head, drills a hole through the tie, pushes the wire up, and solders directly to the rail without melting the tie. And once painted, you don't see it. Again, practice is your friend. You do this a dozen times, you can go to your layout, start soldering feeders, you'll never have problems again. Desoldering. Sometimes you need to remove solder. These are three methods of doing so. At the top, we see the solder sucker bulb. This is what I was taught to use by my father. always used it, and with practice, you can get proficient at using that. On the lower left, you have the solder pump. Many people swear by this. I swear at it. I have never been able to get a solder pump to work. And finally, you have desoldering braid on the lower right. This stuff is magical. What it is simply a copper braid that's impregnated with rosin. You apply it to the joint, apply heat, and it will suck up or wick up the solder in the joint. That's all I have for you today, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Okay, well, thank you, Greg. That was very informative. And we got quite a few questions here that maybe we can spend some time answering.
Sure.
Let's go through them here. Well, first of all, somebody asked, what's the difference between soldering and welding?
Well, that's hard for me to answer because I've never welded. It's a similar technique because you're not just using the strength of the solder or the welding material to hold the pieces together. You're actually melting things together. Welding, I think, is more akin to what we do when we're building a plastic model and using plastic glue, where it melts the plastic so it sticks together. Whereas with solder, you're getting that interaction between the solder on a molecular level with the metal that you're soldering together.
Okay. Yeah. And soldering, welding, of course, is a much higher temperature.
Yes,
and all
of
that
course.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or usually for much heavier stuff than we'd be doing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see. Can you ever set the temperature of your iron too high?
I don't think you can, because the digital ones have an upper limit. And I think when you're using the kind of iron that I use, the top temperature is 800 degrees. I could be wrong on that, but I've never used a tip greater than that. So you're pretty safe. You can't really set it too high. If you're soldering small things, you'll notice right away that it's too hot after you've gotten a little bit of experience.
Yeah. So, and I think maybe that's what people are thinking more, is that you know, can you have it too hot for the work that you're doing? And I guess you can if you're, you're working on a soldering onto a PC board. You don't need as much heat as you would if you're soldering a headlight onto a brass locomotive or something.
Exactly. I've forgotten on occasion to switch back to the 700-degree tip after I've been doing some feeders, and I notice it right away, that because the solder melts faster, and you don't have as much control, it seems, when you're doing on a circuit board or two wires together.
Okay. Let's see what else. Somebody said about the brass in the can for cleaning on iron. Have you used?
Yeah, that's the brass wool kind of stuff. The real advantage of that is it doesn't cool your tip down. If you're using a wet sponge, it of course cools the tip as well. So the brass wool doesn't cool the tip, and also it's not a. I find though with the brass wool, it will wear the tip a little quicker, especially with the very fine tips when I'm using those. Okay. I use both. I have them both right there, and it depends on my mood. I'm very used to the sponge because that's what I've used most of my life. So, but the brass wool is great for it as well. So,
do soldering guns have a place in the hobby? There've been a couple of questions about that come along.
In my opinion, absolutely not. They're not much use at all. The kind that I've used before, you pull the trigger, it heats very quickly. But that tip is so big, I can't see it being useful for much of anything, really. So no, I would say no. Even soldering, an electrician that has to solder could get away with using an iron rather than the gun. The gun just is very popular. It's very, people recognize a soldering gun, but I wouldn't bother buying one at all unless you've, have some use for it.
Okay. What's the, can you discuss the difference between using a soldering iron and using resistance soldering?
I can't say much because I've never used a resistance soldering machine, simply because they're expensive and I've never been able to buy one. But I've seen people use them. I think they're more useful when you're building brass kits or resoldering parts onto a brass steam locomotive than doing electronics work. So, and most of my stuff has been electronics work, so I don't really have experience with that.
Yeah, Speed said something about using it when he does soldering feeders onto to rail because it just heats up that one spot. You're not to have to melt your ties or something, I guess.
Yeah, I've seen it used like that as well.
I guess I have to say that's the same reason I don't have a resistance soldering iron kit, because they're always expensive and I didn't see that. Yeah, but if you're going to do a lot of heavy work like that, it probably might be a good investment. Use a lower temperature for thinner wire.
Definitely, yeah, yep. But even then, you have to make sure that you're using a high enough temperature so you can get in and out very quickly. I've never used anything less than 700-degree tip. Even on the finest 30 gauge wire, 32 gauge wire. I've never had a problem with that. I find it quite useful at that temperature. So
you want to heat it quick and get
that's right. No matter, even, I mean, it's important when you're soldering rails because you don't want to melt your plastic ties to get in and out. But it's the same with a wire. I mean, unless you're using silicone coated wire, the plastic insulation will shrink back and melt if you're in there too long. So.
All right. So now, you said, I believe you said that hot glue was probably a better solution than a cold solder joint. We should make sure that people understand that you really can't use hot glue in place of solder.
Absolutely not. Although I have seen a video of somebody doing that. They wrap wires together and put hot glue on it, but no, that will not do anything.
You get it in between the thing.
Yeah,
I think that was probably a joking comment, but maybe not. Never know. All right. Somebody says, so how do you get the perfect solder joint with smooth as glass surface on the solder?
That's a matter of having the right amount of heat, some flux, and everything not moving as it cools. So if you're holding a wire with your hand, and we all shake a little bit. The older we get, the more we shake. And as it cools, you move the wire, you'll notice that it turns a dull color. And that's the indication of a cold solder joint. So the least amount of movement, you want to get in there, have enough flux, enough heat, and it will cool and be shiny. However, if you're using unleaded solder, which I have never personally used, you'll get a bit of a duller finish than with leaded solder.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Somebody says soldering like painting or gluing. The more solder you use, the better. How do you know if you have enough solder in the joint?
Absolutely not. The more is not better, really. You want just enough solder to make the joint. I think I went over on the board soldering what too much solder looks like. And while it doesn't do any harm, it's not optimal, really. And it can actually cause problems down the road with separation of the solder, breaking away from the circuit board and that kind of thing. But you want that conical shape when you're doing board soldering, and globs of solder on the side of your rail don't look good either. So
true that. Okay. Any thoughts on soldering when using fast tracks fixtures?
I've never used the fast tracks fixture. I've done hand laid turnouts using PC board ties, and that's something I could have gone over, I guess, but I didn't think of that. Again, the most important thing is a clean joint. Clean those PC board ties, clean the bottom of the rail where you want, because that's where you want the solder to be, on the bottom of the rail and the PC board tie, because you don't want a glob of solder beside the rail. And the technique I use flux. I use liquid flux, and I cut a short piece of solder, just about the same length of solder as the width of the PC board tie. And I take that little bit of solder and I nestle it right beside and apply heat. And with the flux, it will suck right in and go underneath, and you won't even see that you've got solder holding that rail to the PC board tie.
Interesting. Somebody said, where do you keep the flux brush, or do you use a new one each time?
I use a new one each time. I use those disposable micro brushes. And the secret to micro brushes is not to buy them at the hobby shop. Sorry, any hobby shop owners, but get them on Amazon. I think they call them teeth cleaners or something. And you can get a package of 500 for $5 or $6.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I've come to use them when I put flux on now too, instead of I had a brush for a long time, but
yeah,
that seems to work better. It's smaller and cleaner. What about soldering decoders, the flat part with no hole? I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay, I know what they mean. Yeah, you just get what we call a solder pad, and it's just a little piece of copper on the decoder board.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So what I do there is I just take the iron, heat the pad, put a little bit of solder on it. You don't want too much. You don't want a big mound of it, but just you get used to it after a while. Then I tin the wire and then bring the wire to that blob, heat it up. And what you want is the blob to cover the top of the wire. You don't want to see any wire there.
Okay.
And a lot of modern locomotives come with the Atlas, what I call the Atlas style decoder, and they use those little plastic things to hold the wire on. And any locomotive I've bought with that, I take all those plastic things off and I solder the wire to the pad.
Okay. All right. I guess we're just about out of time. So thank you, Greg. That was very informative. And we'll look forward. Greg is in the Eastern Canada division. Is it the third Thursday generally?
Third Thursday of every month, we have a presentation. We had it last week, this month, because of NERx this week. And George Dutka was on, and he is excellent as well. And I believe most of our clinics now are being forwarded to Speed to be used on NMRAX in the future. So you can probably catch it there. But if you have any interest in joining in our Thursday nights, just give me an email, gregw66@gmail.com, and I'll make sure you get notified.
All right. Thank you, Greg. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. We're going to move on now to a model showcase here. Speed, if you're ready, you can roll that.
Welcome to the 2025 NERx Model Showcase. Over the course of all 4 nights, you will have the opportunity to see all the models submitted for the showcase. Sit back and enjoy Part 1. This N-scale modern diesel service facility was built by Paul Murata of the Hub Division. The structure project, pictured here, is in many ways the centerpiece of Paul's layout, a modern diesel service facility. Paul kit-bashed together 2 Walthers warehouse kits to form the basis of the facility. The yard contains maintenance services, a caboose track, fueling services, and repair capability. Having formed the basis of the main structure, Paul is working on building the interior of the main service facility. The building exterior will remain removable to expose the interior, which is being scratch built with evergreen and plastic H, L, and truss girders. He expects this particular piece and interior will take at least a couple more months to complete. This HO scale model by Will Lawrence of the Eastern Canada Division is Conrail 6660. It is an Athearn Genesis SD45-2 shell with cannon cab, modified fans, and new wire handrails using Athearn stanchions. Dave Durer of the Lakeshores Division built this book nook. Sometimes, family gifts us with railroad items that don't exactly fit our scale, era, prototype, etc. Nevertheless, they are a good diversion, plus we don't want to put them on a shelf and seem unappreciative. Here's a laser-cut wood kit that Dave received this past Christmas. It is not as precise as our Craftsman kits, but surely good for learning some of the techniques involved. It was Dave's first. Dave said it's a fun little project that I probably wouldn't have picked out myself. John Becker, a member of the Lakeshores Division, constructed and arranged this N-scale diorama to represent a prototypical railside scene. This piece is an integral part of his home T-track layout. Jacobs Coal is an HO model built by Kyle LeBlanc of the Hub Division. The model was scratch-built by Kyle, using as inspiration a model built and photographed for the Walthers catalog by Samuel Parkers. And that's it for Part 1 of the NERx Model Showcase. Part 2 of the showcase will air tomorrow.
I want to share my experience with 12mm static grass. It's not exactly the same as some of the shorter fibers. I used this homemade static grass applicator that I did a clinic on in the 2023 NERx, and I've used it with other types of grass, but when I tried it on a layout with 12mm, it didn't stay up very well. It all fell over and it was just matted down. I could have thrown it down without a static grass applicator and I would have gotten the same results, but I was determined that I wasn't going to use the regular method of putting down static grass for layouts. I'd probably do it like tufts or grass mats and cut pieces of it and put it in. But I had to make the grass on a flat surface where I had better control. And I discovered two things: the fiberglass mesh, Liquid Tex Basics, and it formed into a great little grass mat that actually has a very sturdy backing. That was fine if you wanted your base to have color, but I wanted a clear one, and then I discovered matte gel medium. I use parchment paper to create a non-stick surface so that I can remove the grass backing easily later on. I start with a steel base, and then I attach the parchment paper to the steel base using magnets. At first I put the fiberglass mesh directly onto the magnets, but it was able to dip down into the matte medium and cause the grass to get glued to the fiberglass. You can see the results of that mess in the accompanying photo. For additional support, I use the steel mesh. Has about 1/2 inch square spacing, and attracts the magnets so that I can magnetically attach the fiberglass mesh. Start with the parchment paper attached to the base with magnets. Then I apply the matte gel medium. After that, the combination of the two meshes are applied to the magnets. The clip is attached to the metal base, and then the static grass applicator begins to drop the 12 millimeter fibers through the meshes and into the matte medium. After all of the static grass has been applied, you can let it dry and cure overnight. However, if you needed to get at the grass, you could remove the fiberglass mesh and still rely upon the metal grid to hold the grass upright. This gives me the opportunity to plant additional items into the grass that are too large for the 1/8 inch openings in the fiberglass mesh, but can still be supported by the steel mesh. In this case, I'm planting cattails, which would certainly get hung up if I was trying to remove the fiberglass mesh around them. Here's the final result, showing all the grass, and it's standing up pretty straight, having been supported by the two different meshes. And still in the midst of the grass, you can see the cattails still standing up. I hope that this information was helpful to you, and that maybe it gave you some ideas for your own modeling. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Hope that you enjoyed those tips. We're going to move right along here to our roundtable discussion for this evening on railroad prototype modelers. And I'm going to introduce Dave Owens, who is going to introduce the rest of his panel, and we'll get started with our discussion. Dave?
Thank you, Ed. Joining me is an old hand in the RPM arena, and that's Eric Hansman. Eric hosts a website that has all kinds of great information. Most importantly, a calendar of prototype meets around the country that he works hard to keep updated. And so Eric's an old hand, and also joining us is Michelle Kempema of the Colorado Model Railroad Museum, who has begun attending prototype meets and can talk about what she has found and is working hard to organize one. I've worked with a group of friends to run the Northeast Railroad Prototype Modelers Meet, and we've done that for about 23 years. We began in Connecticut, where I live, and we are now in Springfield, Massachusetts, because one of the things we struggle with these meets is finding venues. We're now at the Sheraton in Springfield, Massachusetts. Our event comes up the weekend after Memorial Day, May 30, 31. We have layout open houses on Sunday, June 1. But that's us. And did you want to lead the conversation, Ed, or should I?
No, I would defer to you folks to lead your conversation, decide what you want to, I hope have decided what you want to talk about.
Okay.
And we'll try and see if we get some questions in the chat that we can pull up.
Okay. I think a couple of points I'd like to make, and I know that Michelle and Eric can expand on these tremendously. are what proto meets are and what they're not. And we've talked about how maybe the name prototype modelers meet is a bit unfortunate in that it suggests that we're some sort of exclusive group of modelers who are going to look down on people. And that's just not the case. Our events, I think, to a T, are just about modeling. We welcome, we invite, we want modelers of all levels. We want everybody to come together who enjoys this great hobby, who likes to build models, and who wants to learn. I've been doing this since I was about 7 years old, and I consider myself a fair to middling modeler. I have a lot to learn, and I've learned a lot from the people I've met at prototype meets going back 23, 25 years. So I think that's the most important point. These are events for everybody. Everybody's welcome. Everybody is encouraged to come. Everyone is encouraged to bring their models to display. Meet generally consists of a variety of clinics, a model display room where models of all levels are welcome, complete models, models in process, and then there are typically some vendors, and then there are some social periods where everybody can get together, hang out, and chat. Some meets have their model rooms set up to be almost lounges where people can hang around and talk about models and just be very comfortable and have a great time. So that's my quick synopsis of what a prototype modelers meet is and what it's not. How about you, Eric? Can you share some of your views and thoughts on that?
Well, in general, no matter what we do in this hobby, if we freelance, we still have to understand what the prototype did, where the brakes go, how the track works, what special hardware goes on a steam locomotive, what goes on a diesel. Even if it's your own railroad, you still have to, it helps if you understand what you're putting on as far as details. It's also easier to fall back and see what the prototypes did with architectural aspects on depots and section houses and freight houses and how they laid out their yards. And so it's easy to copy some of that and modify it a bit and replicate it on your own freelance layout too. So it's, the core is learning from the prototype. As I mentioned to many people, let the prototype be your guide. Even if you freelance, there's a lot to learn from just looking at the prototype and what they did. And that is one of the core aspects of railroad prototype modeler meets.
And Michelle, could you talk to us about your first experience, when you first went to a meet, why you went, and what it was like, what you discovered?
Oh yeah, for sure. I was asked if the Colorado Model Railroad Museum would be interested in putting on an RPM, and I just said no because I'm busy. Blah, blah. And on the third time someone asked me, I said, "No, what's an RPM?" I didn't even know what it was. So then I went, "That's really interesting. That's really interesting," because I have learned in my journey there are so many parts to this hobby, and people kind of have a favorite. And I also know that in my region in northern Colorado, our modelers are a little bit dispersed and disjointed and not connected very well. And so I saw this as an opportunity to really highlight modeling and the people who make things. And I realized I didn't know half of the modelers around here, and I needed to, right? Because I need to know everybody. And so I called Eric and said, "What's this RPM thing? Tell me what I'm doing." And so he sent me this really nice document, and you can actually find Eric's document on the Colorado RPM website, the corpm.org. And it talks about the displays, the clinics, the vendors, and the fellowship of all of it. And I took that to our board of directors, and they said, "We absolutely need to do this." And I'd planned to do it now in 2025, and they said, "No, you have to do something in 2024. This is important." So I did a one-day kickoff last year just to learn it, and loved it. But first I went to Valley Forge. And so I went to the Valley Forge RPM to see what that was all about. And that one is very clinic focused. And I learned the importance of clinics and the fellowship of people in the hallway after clinics saying, "Hey, that was awesome. I loved learning where you're at on your layout this year versus last year." Or I'd hear somebody say, oh, I love that you did that structure. I was wondering, how that was going to turn out. And so obviously there's fellowship that happens here. And so now the freelance part is really interesting to me. And I attended the Home Shops clinic at Valley Forge, and I thought it was really fascinating. And I do understand freelance because our layout here is proto freelance. And going through the journey of understanding what we have here, I understand how it follows the prototype, like Eric was saying. So this year in 2025's Colorado RPM, Home Shops is actually going to sponsor a freelance forum, like a whole track of clinics and programming for freelance and proto freelance modelers at what's already a normal RPM. And then we're also going to have a narrow gauge piece that we're going to focus a little bit of clinics on that. So that's kind of what I'm doing in a nutshell on this. But I think it is super important to understand it's all based on the prototype. And had I had the perfect name, it would be like a scale modelers meet or something.
Yeah.
We also have, because it was my first year last year, we have a volunteer here who makes military models. So we did a whole room of tanks and boats, and he had ships and submarines, and they were fabulous because it's scale modeling. So I might be stepping outside the box a little more than I'm supposed to for an RPM, but
yeah. There's a lot to be learned from the military modelers. They do some really fantastic stuff, especially about painting and detailing and that sort of thing. Yeah.
The military guys seem to lead the way with a lot of the skills that we adopt eventually, especially when it comes to weathering and whatnot. They're really a talented group of people.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric.
And I always stress to people that every RPM is a little different. No two are the same, and I don't encourage them to be the same. You each have an interesting audience, an interesting location, interesting rail and industry history. Lean on that and focus on what works in your area. Michelle brought up something great. The narrow gaugers. I consider a lot of the narrow gauge modelers to be essentially some of the first prototype modelers because they, were just going crazy about making sure they captured the essence of Colorado narrow gauges or, wherever. And I think we learned a lot from them in the hobby too, as well as the military modelers and their techniques.
And I think prototype meets, I hope to agree, it takes in all aspects of the hobby. There are people who bring in and show locomotives. You'll always see a lot of freight cars. You'll see passenger cars, but you'll also see vehicles. You'll see maintenance of way equipment. You'll see buildings and structures and bridges and all kinds of stuff. And some of the neatest stuff, I believe, stuff that's not even complete. It's in process. You get to see how somebody's building something. I was blown away at our meet one year when a gentleman named Joe Smith brought New Haven electric locomotive that he was building from scratch. And it was just breathtaking to see how he was putting this together, and just to be able to appreciate his craftsmanship.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's true. We've said you learn more sometimes from seeing something in process than from looking at the finished product. It's the same with the layout. If you visit, you shouldn't wait with layout visits until it's all done. You should go and see what, how are you building that? What are you doing with that benchwork? How are you running those wires? Oh, look at that.
When I go to see layouts, I like to take pictures of the benchwork, get an understanding of how they put the layout together. And I also like to look at their workbenches and where they do their modeling, because they get a sense of how they do that. Because mine is kind of a disaster area, but I'm always looking for inspiration to find a better way.
I think so. One thing that's been interesting for me with RPMs is that I see them more as a trade show in the modeling world versus a train show, which has public and a public face, right? And you have families with kids and they come and da-da. This is really an industry specific kind of meet. It's like show and tell for modelers. Even if you don't put something on the table, it's really fun to go and see what other people build, right? I think there's something in an RPM for everyone who's involved in this hobby. And I think sometimes they think,
work a little bit on a model, make some progress each day. Eric, you had some neat observations, I think.
Yeah, my main takeaways from RPM meets are how people share so much. It's not just showing their models and sharing their model there, but it's talking about what they've done. Every presentation, it's a combination of modeling and historical context, And you just walk out, when you go home, you're just so charged up. You've recharged the batteries, and you just can't wait to, sink your soul into some new project, or try to finish up something that's been sitting on the workbench for way too long. Um, there's just so much going on at RPM, and just about everyone you talk to, every time you turn around, there's something new that you're learning. It's sharing the knowledge, sharing what we know, sharing our resources. That a rising tide lifts all boats type of thing.
And I think it might be worthwhile to talk about the clinics a little bit to give a sense of some of the clinics we have at meets, so people understand that.
Sure.
And maybe you can join in with that. Both of you can join in. Some of the folks come on, they'll talk about their layout, progress they've made on their layout, what they're building, what they're modeling, why they're modeling that, which can be very interesting. We have.
I can go through the clinic list for RPM East that's coming up this weekend.
That's a great idea. And why don't you mention where that's happening, Eric?
Yeah, that's happening 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh in Youngwood, Pennsylvania, just off the New Stanton interchange of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. We've got over 200 people registered, and 39 presentations from 38 speakers. We've got 40 vendor tables. There'll be over, there should be a couple hundred models on display there. There's operating sessions that are scheduled for Thursday night. Most of those are full now, but most of those layouts will be open for Sunday self-guided layout tour too. So am I sharing my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, we don't see it yet.
All right. Let me see here. I'll do this again. Here we go. And here's this is my blog. This is a resource page on my blog. It's the RPM event calendar. And this is where I've listed so many things. As you can see, it's just not one or two things happening in a year. There's a whole host of things happening and on this calendar all the way to November right now, all over the country, several in Canada too. So, it's something easy to find. RPM calendar on Google probably gets you right there. Let me go to the RPM East website. You should be able to see that fine.
And these events are of all sizes. RPM East is at least 200 folks, but
yes,
an RPM with 50 people or with 25 people is just as terrific.
Yep.
Some are 1 day or 2 days. They're all great.
Yep. Some are small, some are larger. The one in St. Louis usually pushes close to 1,000 people. But here's what we have lined up. We're starting right off with prototype information on the California and Oregon Coast Railroad, and then shipping transformers from the Westinghouse plant in Sharon, something very specific. Cambrian, Indiana hopper fleet. So it really ranges all over the place, different eras. Most of this is centered around the Western Pennsylvania area. So, there's that it's kind of regional in some ways for some of these. So, you have that too. I'm doing a presentation on team tracks and team yards that has been going over pretty well with many different people. Here we have Matt Hurst kit bashing steam era hopper cars. So that should be interesting for anyone who has to haul coal or ore. And someone else is doing ACF early center flow covered hoppers. So there's a wide variety. Nick Santo is presenting on his decoder buddy. So it's not just about prototype. It's also some aspects on how you can make your railroad run better too. There's weathering. There's just all sorts of different presentations all lined up here for RPM East coming up this weekend.
There's some guy doing a clinic on fire trucks.
Oh gosh, yes. Where is that guy? There he is. Dave Owens, HO scale fire equipment. Yeah. So it's just all sorts of interesting stuff. And almost every RPM is loaded with it. They may not have 38 speakers, but the variety and quality of the presentations is pretty high. And then we can look at the models that that are presented too. And let me go back to that. I need to.
I think you have to reshare so we can.
Yes, I do. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Go back to this, and I just added this link to the RPM calendar. These are all the photo galleries that I've created over the years from different RPM meets that I've attended. So you can dive into any one of these. We'll go to the RPM Valley Forge that was held, and this is the one that Michelle went to first. And these are just some of the models that were on display. It's hard to take photos of everything, but these are
seeing the photos. I don't know. Are the rest of you guys seeing the photos, or is it just?
No, we're not seeing them.
We're still seeing your calendar. But okay. Yeah. And I participated at that RPM at Valley Forge. I decided if I was going to go, I would participate. So I painted an N-scale mural off of the mural on the museum here, and I put it on the table because I wanted to be a participant and understand what this was about. And it was really fun. I got to explain to people what it was and why it was there. There, now I see your pictures.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'll just keep, going through some of these so everyone can see some of what you can see in the model display room at a railroad prototype modeler meet.
Something I learned, Eric, was that the RPM will provide you a piece of paper to describe it, or you can print your own and bring like a photo that goes with it to explain it. And I think people who've never been to one, that's a little bit confusing when you first look at an RPM. So when you put something on the table, you can put a piece of paper that explains it.
Some people will put their model, and then they'll put the photograph of the real thing out on the railroad, which is kind of interesting. You see that especially with weathering projects, and it's amazing. There are some true artists out there. There's a guy named Butch Eiler. He's one of the most remarkable modelers I've ever seen, and he's an artist. Butch is an artist. Bottom line,
his models are on the Colorado RPM big banner.
Yeah, Butch is an amazing guy who's just been an innovator in so many ways, and Butch goes to every prototype meet, and Butch likes to have a table where he sits there and he'll work on models, and you pull up a chair and you talk to Butch and he tells you how he does things.
And those are called hands-on stations, from what I understand, or something of that nature. And that is another piece of RPMs. And we had that at ours too. Butch came last year, and he'll be coming again this year, I think, to do that. So you can kind of see the paper. Look, that's Bill Schneider's. I can see it.
I was going to say, you talked about the narrow gaugers, but the other guys who are the icons of these things are the O&W modelers. They've got, if you're going to model one of those camelbacks, you've got to.
There's a fellow named Mal Hauk who comes to our meet, and he's
Mal, yeah.
He's an attorney in near Boston. Yeah, but he's a prolific O&W modeler who is he's a machinist. He makes these incredible O&W steam engines, and it's mind-boggling. And he's just a fun, great guy. Again, a guy who is willing to share what he knows.
True.
I believe Mal just recently became a master model railroad.
That's right.
Yes.
Something I didn't understand when I first started doing the RPM was the display table piece. Not only just putting this piece of paper with it to explain it, but I said, how do I assign space to people? And I was told, you don't. They just put it on the display table. And I went, how does that work? But it does work. And so the display tables have white claws. So if you're going to an RPM for the first time, and sometimes they're higher, and we raised ours up to a taller height, so you have to bend over to see the models, but you can have space. Now, don't take 3 tables because that's rude, but you can have space to put out your section of work, and everybody kind of works together and crowds theirs in a little, you get somebody else in. And honestly, I think the fellowship of just sharing the tables really shows the heart of an RPM. So the ability for everybody to get along and make it all work.
We've got a few questions here. Maybe we could bring them in here a little bit. Let me see. The big couple of questions that we have here is what challenges do you face in organizing an RPM meet, and what kind of things would somebody expect to go through if they were going to try and get one in their particular area?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Our event began in a community center in a town called Canton, Connecticut, and we outgrew that space and we ended up going to a hotel. Lodging has always been an issue. We struggled to find a hotel, and we kind of joked that we killed 3 hotels. Every time we found a hotel, we'd be in there for a year or two, and then something drastic would happen. We're pretty confident we're not going to kill the Sheraton in Springfield, Massachusetts. But it's a challenge. And as we came out of the pandemic, hotels, especially hotels, realized they could make a lot more money with weddings, a bunch of model railroaders showing off their models. So finding a place that can accommodate a meet can be a challenge. One of the neat things the guys at RPM East have done, the event coming up this weekend, is they are in a community college. And that was an innovative approach. I believe the guys run the Valley Forge meet are exploring a similar option. So a meet can be anywhere. Typically, if you have people traveling in, you want to have some sort of lodging nearby. And a hotel can work, but hotels, unfortunately, often want catering, and that can be difficult. So we always try to focus on keeping it someplace that is inexpensive as possible. A church hall on a Saturday.
Okay.
That obviously won't work on a Sunday, but a lot of meets are Friday, Saturday. So community centers, church halls, maybe schools that are out of session.
I always recommend not to start too big. Just work on something small, see what kind of local interest there is, and take it from there. You
Good
just
advice.
need a couple clinics in the morning, maybe everyone bring a lunch, a couple clinics in the afternoon, have space to display some models, and bingo, you've got your own little RPM right there. And then you gauge the interest from the local people who attend. And that's key, because most of the time, most of the people who attend your RPM will be from your local area.
Right.
There will be people who come in. We're lucky at RPM East. We've got a whole group coming in from Connecticut, Dave Owens and many of his friends. I noticed we got 6 modelers coming down from Erie, PA.
Oh, that's
we
great.
got several coming in from Ohio. Usually we have a number coming in from Baltimore and Washington too. So, but starting small is key. You just want to see how it goes. You don't want to take too big of a chance. But things can.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
No, go
I'm
If
in
you
a
only have half a dozen clinics, that's okay too. You don't need to, do your own thing.
And that's so. Not only did I have to worry about an affordable venue and all of that, I had to explain what an RPM is, because out here in the West, there's not an RPM within 1,000 miles of us. There is no drivable RPM from here other than St. Louis, right? And that's a 16-hour drive for me. So our local people I would say 75% had no idea what an RPM was that attended the RPM last year. They just trusted me. When I went to the train show and talked to everybody and said, please come understand what it is, we fed them a free dinner to get them to stay and tell us about what they thought, so I could get feedback. So I did a one-day event across the street from the museum. I had sponsors buy dinner that night, and I gave out feedback forms. And I said, did you enjoy this event? I had 100% say, yes, loved it. And I said, what would we do different? And I made them go out to lunch. I couldn't deal with lunches the first year. I can't take on catering and all of that. So I made them, and they didn't want to go to lunch. They wanted boxed lunches so they didn't have to leave. So this year we're going to add boxed lunches like they did at Valley Forge. And I saw how that works. And so I also have tripled my space, because we ran out of space in like the first 30 minutes. So, but it was interesting having to get people to understand what an RPM is. I don't know that what we did would be possible without the museum. and us taking on the financial burden of putting it on that the first time. And hopefully this year we break even. We did not make money last year. We lost money, but the museum saw it as a program of the Colorado Model Railroad Museum for modelers who are not the operators that are here all the time, for the other modelers that we don't know. So we did it as programming. It's a totally different way to look at it. But we're really isolated. And so we had to do that for people to understand. So it's a little different. Back in the East, everybody knows what an RPM is. And so a little different ball game. But we found really an affordable price. We're going to do a 2-day event this year and have lunch there. And I also got feedback they wanted some layouts. So we're allowing layouts to come, which was very confusing to them when I didn't give them 20 free passes and a subsidized gas like they do at train shows, because they're participating. And I'm like, no, you have to actually buy a registration. And they've been wonderful. So I think everybody's understanding it now. Understanding an RPM when all you've ever known is a train show is really different.
Okay. So what's that brings to mind, what's a typical registration fee that you pay? Do you pay a different fee if you're bringing a model or if you're just coming to it? Or
it's from what I saw, I just did research on this to make sure our pricing was good. So most one-day events are $15 to $20.
okay.
The bigger ones in hotels cost more because they have a hotel overhead. So they're $65.
Okay.
Ours is going to be $35 at an event center that I get a half price as a nonprofit. And so I came in right in the middle at $35 for 2 days. I'm hoping that's affordable. It's like not a painful price point. I don't know. What do you think, Eric?
Well, we charged, again, every situation's different. For RPM East, we had an early registration of $40 for the 2-day event. After the last day of February here, it went up to $45. And that'll be that way at the door. There's also single day options at the door. So yeah, we try to keep it low. I try to think about how for the price of a nice ready to run Rapido model, you can go to an RPM, for your registration.
Most of the meets I've been to, and with our meet, we're not trying to make money. We're not trying to lose money.
Right.
We want to break even, and we want to pay the bills, and just create an event that people want to come back to, that's sustainable, that people enjoy and look forward to each year.
So most of them, you don't have there's not an overarching organization that has to be ongoing all the time and have other things that they have to do. It's just
No,
it's just a local group, just like Michelle and David. We're the local folks taking care of it.
This is where I really struggled at the beginning. I'm like, wait, there's no like guidelines, and there's no assigning table space, and there's no, and it really is free form. I think that shows that it just kind of organically grew from the modelers. And I think the spirit of it is that it stays very unique to your location and how you want to do it. I'm really excited to see what happens this year, to see who we become next year. Right? Because this year's another experiment again. We're just going to go and have as much fun as we possibly can and see what we want to do next year.
Now, as you do get more vendors, you do need to assign tables. That gets more difficult because some vendors need only one table, some vendors need 6. So, but that's, the only time I know where things are really assigned at an RPM.
Well, I assigned vendor tables. I thought
vendors.
Yeah, just display tables are the only ones that are free for all. Vendors actually pre-register.
Yep. So,
one of the cool things about a prototype meet is the mix of vendors. You'll get those people who may be a basement, or a guy creating parts, 3D printing. It's the 3D printing explosion. Really seeing some terrific people come into the hobby marketplace, and it's just unique products that you're not going to see at a giant train show. You're going to see some really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Here's some nice locomotives for a proto freelance layout.
Those are really nice.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It seems like you get more locomotives and cars than you do structures, but you get structures as well for display.
And I think that may be just a function of ease of transport.
Yes.
And the size.
That's true. Yeah.
But we have had some incredible structures at our meet, and they're pretty neat. We had a guy an incredible modeler named Ray Schofield, who built the Framingham, Massachusetts station, and it was a great big model and just spectacularly done.
Mm-hmm.
And around the RPM, there's things where you go visit layouts, there's operating sessions. So they do grow into more. I only have one operating session this year, and that's here at the museum, but we are going to have some open houses this year at layouts. So, right, start small and every year add a little more. And so there's more things that go on around it too.
Here's a nice structure. This is N scale, and it was displayed at the last year's Naperville RPM. Also, the Steve Holzheimer, who built this, did a wonderful presentation on using special computer cutting technology, and that's how he built this.
Wow.
He had all the pieces cut out and then basically layered them.
Somebody else here asked, I'm not a prototypical modeler, but can I still come to an RPM meet? Obviously, the answer is yes, definitely.
Everyone's welcome.
Come on ahead. Yeah. I mean, if somebody's brought a freelance model, that's fine as well, right?
Absolutely.
I tell you, even if you're brand new to the hobby, you should go to an RPM. There's the inspiration piece, the connection to other modelers. You might find someone who loves the same railroad you do or the style of modeling you like. And then you have someone to ask a question to. So, I mean, even I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Somebody else, let's see what else here. There isn't any particular criteria for something to be considered an RPM meet. It's whatever you decide that it is, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
I think that's fair.
All right, so let's
showing modeling though, right? Like I think it's about the creativity that goes into the hobby. The RPM is about whatever structure item, whatever you're building, you are modeling it. Okay. So I would say that would be a criteria.
Okay, so now the question we haven't really discussed. Somebody asked if are the events connected to the NMRA? Do you need to be an NMRA member to go? The answer is no. No. But what do you see? You know, there was this, for a while, there was this competition or whatever between the NMRA and the RPM. I think that's, we've said enough.
So ours was co-sponsored by our NMRA division. So the Colorado RPM.
That's the question. How do we see the two things sort of working together? I mean, we all have the idea that we want to better the hobby. We want to make people better modelers. We want to encourage the hobby. How do you see ways that we could work together more to bring these things about? Both in terms of the NMRA. For a while, there was the big thing about the contest versus the there's no judgmental kinds of things. I think maybe we've put that to bed as well. But how would you see the NMRA and the RPMs working together better than we do right now?
I think we already are.
Yeah.
We are. Ours was co-sponsored by the Northern Colorado division of the NMRA. And that's who were the volunteers who put it on. And I would say they're like this. It's the same people.
We had a similar relationship with the NMRA. It was very supportive and helpful of our event early on. I think there is some of that bumping heads that probably came many years ago caused the meets to come about. But I think those rivalry, not even rivalries, those little disagreements are long in the past, and I think generally meaningless. We're all about welcoming everybody and working together and just promoting what I think we all think is a great hobby.
Yep,
I agree. Let's see what else we got. I think we've run through most of the questions. What's your Somebody said, and maybe each one of you can talk about this a little bit, what your favorite part of an RPM meet is. And then somebody asked, what's the most unique thing that someone's brought to display?
Well, let me tell a story about Malvern, the Malvern Valley Forge meet a couple of years ago. I grew up in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, along the Bethlehem branch of the Reading Railroad, and had been searching for photographs, for information about a place that I used to see as a kid along the Bethlehem branch. It was called Glenside Lumber and Coal, and of course, it had a fire and was gone. And I searched and I searched and I searched, and I just couldn't find anything because I thought it would be a neat structure to model. Well, I go to the Malvern meet, and there's a model of the whole complex, and a guy is doing a clinic on the Glenside Lumber and Coal Company, and that was like my eureka moment. And I just took tons of photos of his model, which was amazing, and devoured his clinic, and it was just like one of the greatest things I've attended. Another great clinic was one I attended at RPM East in Greensburg, well, actually in Youngwood, 2 years ago. Mike Niedzakowski is from Jeannette, Pennsylvania, right near where the meet is. He runs this magnificent hobby shop in Jeannette. And Mike did a clinic on Jeannette's relationship with the railroad, history. Jeannette's a center of glass manufacturing. And it was great. Mike's got a great personality to begin with, but he just did this amazing clinic full of history, and I was fascinated by it. I love to understand when I travel why things are here. Why is this place here? What did people do to make a living? What do people still do to make a living? So those were two clinics in particular that really struck me.
What about the other folks?
Well, for myself, I'd say the last time I attended the Northeastern RPM, when I had the opportunity, I just happened to set up my models beside Malcolm Houck, who had a dozen scratch-built HO scale New York, Ontario, and Western steam locomotives on display. And my work just paled. But we sat, we talked, and I learned a lot just from that. And of course, on day 2, he had a second dozen scratch-built
Yep.
O&W steam locomotives.
Yeah.
It's just, but he was just happy to sit and talk and explain some things, how he worked on the boilers, built the frames, sourced the wheels and drivers and motors and all that stuff. And I learned so much that day.
Yeah.
Those 2 days.
That's amazing. I was surprised by a clinic that we had last year. And one of their NMRA division members, Rich, said, I built my whole railroad off the accounting records of this specific railroad. And I said, well, that's interesting. And he did a whole clinic on how he developed his entire layout based off of what products were moved when and how much of each. And I thought it was fascinating. I had no idea. What a creative way to do that.
And that's a fundamental of, railroads. They exist, they're businesses. They exist to move things. They exist to make money, and understanding what they moved, where they moved it from is really important.
Yeah.
That's all part of the history.
Okay. So we got maybe 5 minutes or so left or so. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with here?
I would just encourage anybody who, if they have an opportunity to attend a meet, do it. I think you'll enjoy yourself, no matter where it is, no matter how long it is. It's, as Eric said, the cost of admission is probably not much more, or probably less than a nice freight car. Yeah. And you're going to have a great time. You're going to meet a lot of people. A lot of the folks in our hobby tend to be lone wolves hanging out in their basements. And this is just a great opportunity to connect with other people, to connect with people who share your interest. And I think it's just, I know that I've met people through attending meets that have become my friends who I value greatly.
I totally agree with that. I love the fellowship that an RPM creates in the hobby. I love seeing what people do. I'm the great celebrator of what other people do. So I think I would highly recommend attending an RPM.
I've learned so much from so many people, made some very, very good friends, just like Dave mentioned over the years. I'm indebted to the people I learned from. So that's one reason why I promote these and help participate in these, and wave the flag. That's mainly it.
This is a great way to continue the hobby, right? Pass on your knowledge, pass on your skills. This is a great place to go and do that. It's different than a train show. You actually can take the time to talk and learn and get to know each other. So it's just a really different format, and I loved it.
If I could
Don't
say one
hesitate to
thing
bring
here,
kids. Don't hesitate to bring kids.
yeah, if I could say one thing here, I hope people don't get the impression that all they have at these meets are older steam era stuff, because I'm biased. I'm model 1926, so I tend to accidentally take photos of more of the older stuff. But there's plenty of modern equipment on display too. There was only a smattering shown, but there's a lot there. It's not just steam era. It's all over the map.
Eric, can you somebody asked if you could scroll back to the list of events once again.
Yes, I can. Let's see.
All right.
I'm gonna probably stop sharing here and have to go back to the event calendar page. There we go.
Share the event calendar.
There's the if you need the address, it's there at the top of the page. You should probably be able to see that. But
You've kind of organized this by the dates that they happen throughout the year.
Definitely. Yeah. The most recent stuff is on top. And usually I wait a month before, like the March stuff, I'll probably drop off sometime mid-April. And then I put it down here for past events. So the link is always there. And whenever these kick in with new dates, they'll go up into the like the active list and the active calendar.
Cool. All right, folks. So take a look. Get yourselves. I'm going to try and get to that New England one this year. I've had it on my to-do list for a long time. Something always seems to get in the way, but I'm going to see what I can do. Is maybe I'll see one or the other of you up there at that. All right. Thank you very much to our panel. We're going to move right on here, I guess. The next thing we have is we're going to move right on to one of our tips and tricks. This is called Let Those Cars Roll by Bill Harley. Speed, roll the tape.
About 25 years ago, I wanted to improve the free rolling capabilities of my model car fleet, many cars of which were 30 years old at that time. Why the concern about free rolling cars? Well, a free rolling car performs better in all circumstances and allows the running of longer trains. This car is typical of the cars that were in my fleet. Note how far it rolls. It stalls on a downhill grade. This was my first try at improving the roll capabilities of my car fleet. It is a car from a 1953 Mantua train set. The largest number of cars in my fleet were similar to this Athearn Blue Box car, which rolls okay. It makes it to the bottom of the grade. This car represents my new standard of replacing wheel sets in existing plastic or Delrin frames. This is typical of the rolling quality of high-end ready-to-run cars on the market today. However, many cars still come with plastic wheel sets, which tend to be marginal rollers. Here's a partial list of manufacturers who produce metal wheel sets, Delron truck frames, or ready-to-roll replacement trucks with metal wheel sets. This is a brass, heavy caboose with Tahoe trucks that outperforms all of the cars shown here. Thanks for watching.
Okay, welcome back. Thank you. I just want to again remind you that NERx is sponsored by Mini Prints, Interaction Hobbies, Mind Mount Models, and Tony's Train Exchange. Every night's a brand new drawing for 2 separate $50 gift vouchers from one of these sponsors. Tonight it is Mind Mount Models. They are our featured sponsor, and Ron will be here to join us for Pull the Winners at 10 o'clock. The drawing, the registration cuts off at 9:30. If you haven't registered already, please go do that. The link to that is in the feed for YouTube. So get in there and do it. Get your name in there. That's $50 too. There's 2 $50 tickets. We also want to thank Around the Layout podcast for their work in helping to broadcast this. And I want to remind you also that NERx is brought to you free of charge by the NER. If you would like to donate, go to our website, nerx.org, and scroll to the donate button, and it'll let you do it with a credit card or through PayPal. All donations are gratefully accepted. You'll get a letter from the president thanking you for it, which you can frame if you want to, I guess. We're going to move right along here and get to our next layout. This is the Manhattan Terminal of Bruce Ryan. And I'm going to tell you that I've run on this layout now twice. It's just Bruce lives about an hour from me, and it's just a fantastic layout. You're going to love this. He uses the proto throttles, and I had never run with one before, and that was just fantastic. It's convinced me that I've got to get one for my switching part of my layout. The Manhattan Terminal is a 1.6 mile proto freelance layout focused on urban switching in the west side of Manhattan in the mid-1960s. The layout is inspired by terminal railroads in New York Harbor, which received cars by car float, and the New York Central's West Side Freight Line, particularly the High Line, an elevated freight line that ran south of 30th Street Yard. The layout features urban scenery and details on the streets of Manhattan, and it's just, again, as I say, just fantastic. He has 18 customers, and the largest is the New York Central Freight House at 33rd Street, the Riverside Food Terminal, Nabisco, the New York Meat Terminal, and other customers include Soconi Mobile, 2 cold storage warehouses, a grocery distributor, a furniture warehouse, and a team track. So here is the Manhattan Terminal of Bruce Ryan. Roll the tape, Speed.
Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Ryan and welcome to the Manhattan Terminal Railroad. We're on the west side of Manhattan in the mid-1960s. This is an HO scale urban switching layout with 2 inspirations. One is the New York Central Railroad and its operation on the west side of Manhattan, the West Side Freight Line, and in particular the High Line, which ran south of 30th Street Yard. It was an elevated freight line. And then New York Terminal Railroads, which received cars only by car float, and there was about 3 dozen of those in New York Harbor. The layout is a shelf layout. It's 75 linear feet long and 18 to 24 inches wide. We started construction on the benchwork in January of 2012, so we're 13 years in. The DCC system is an NCE wireless system, but we use proto throttles to operate the trains. We have 2 operating crews. The yard crew works the north end of the layout and switches 8 industries here, including the freight house, a cold storage warehouse, a grocery distributor, an oil dealer, and a few others. And the other crew heads to the south end of the layout and switches Nabisco, another cold storage warehouse, and a large food terminal. The layout is really all about switching, and we use switch lists. I generate the switch list really by industry. I use a New York Central freight circular from 1963 to identify potential shippers for the customers on my layout. I also use the OBSIG industrial database, which lists customers and shippers in various locations, and between those two documents I've identified a number of shippers for the customers on the layout. So let's go on a tour of Western Manhattan in the mid-1960s. Okay, we're looking at a car float here. It's at the Pier 72 float bridge about 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. And this was prototypical at a time. There was a float bridge on 33rd Street run by the New York Central for the early part of the 20th century. It disappeared later, but I've kept it here, and the trains for our operating session arrived by this car float from Weehawken, New Jersey, which was home to a major New York Central yard. This is Water Street. On this layout, here's where proto-freelancing enters the picture. On Western Manhattan, we'd be looking at West Street or the West Side Highway, depending on the era. But I chose to do Water Street because that's the street I grew up on in Manhattan. And I just like the look of this Pier Station building and kind of the old cobblestone street running along the river. So after the yard crew unloads the car float and crosses Water Street, it arrives here in 30th Street Yard. On the prototype New York Central, 30th Street Yard was large and probably had close to 100 tracks and different yards for a produce terminal and a brewery and freight houses and so on. But here we have a 33rd Street freight terminal, which is switched during an operating session. Then also tracks in the yard where the operators will place cars that have arrived from Weehawken by car float and get them ready for distribution around the layout. On the New York Central in 30th Street Yard, there were a number of freight houses, which were long, skinny buildings like this one. Here we have just one. During an operating session, it will receive LCL freight from upstate New York, as well as other cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and it's one of the main customers served by the yard crew during an operating session. Terminal Stores Warehouse and Central Stores were both warehouses on the west side of Manhattan. Central Stores was served by the New York Central, and that's the one that's served here by the yard crew on the layout. The Terminal Stores building was a very large block-long building on the west side, and so I've tried to replicate the size of it here, though it's not directly served by rail here. We're looking down 11th Avenue here and also at the Macy's warehouse. Macy's warehouse is not exactly where the prototype was, but Macy's did have a warehouse served by the New York Central in and around 30th Street Yard. The Macy's store itself was closer to Midtown. So this is the Midtown team track, and this is again where proto-freelancing enters the picture. I of course like the idea of team tracks because you can really have any rail car served by a team track. But in my case, I've also focused on auto parts and tires for this team track, and as I've looked for shippers, many of them are tire and auto part manufacturers that are sending parts to New York City. This is my representation of Midtown Manhattan, so of course there's a traffic jam and taxi cabs and a police officer and a subway stop. This is a corner of the layout, and when it comes to corners and the tracks have to turn for a corner, I like there to be a reason why the tracks have to turn. So I try to disguise the corners and have some, in this case, buildings present, which the railroad needed to avoid because these are important buildings in Midtown Manhattan. This is Saucony Mobile, and again, this is a proto-freelance part of the layout, and I have a lot of customers that use freight cars and reefers, so this helps me introduce different kinds of cars to the layout. And I like the look of mobile trucks and mobile tank cars, So we've added Saucony Mobile to the layout that is switched by the yard crew. So this is 28th Street and really just a representation of a busy city street in Manhattan, and it's actually a bridge over the layout. And here I'm just really trying to capture city life on the west side of Manhattan. This is Alvarez Salvage, one of the trashy parts of the layout. And this is also served by the yard crew on the same spur as the Midtown Team Track and Saucony Mobile. And you can see the empty gondola there awaiting a load to be taken back to the yard. This is R.C. Williams and Basanti Produce. R.C. Williams is on the left of the shot. And on the New York Central High Line, R.C. Williams was one of the major customers between 25th and 26th Street. And it was a large international grocery distributor. And here it's a grocery distributor as well. Currently has 3 cars and 1 off spot. And next to R.C. Williams is Basanti Produce. That's a proto freelance entry into the customers on the layout, and it receives produce from the south and from the west. We're looking down 27th Street, and one thing to note here is the backdrop. All of the backdrops of the streets on this layout are photos taken from the actual High Line. And the High Line in modern days, the old railroad line, is now an elevated park that runs for about 1.5 miles down the west side of Manhattan. And it's actually a very beautiful park, and the history of the railroad is also very present. So we're looking back toward Midtown now along the High Line, and the signal here is the one and only signal on this layout. And to my knowledge, there were no signals at all on the New York Central High Line. But this signal is, during an operating session, switched by me, and it indicates to the crew that's come south out of the yard that they're clear to go back to the yard. This is a collection of industrial buildings that I've set up to run right along the Hudson River, and you can see the tracks in front of the buildings right on the edge of the river. And this represents a change that I made to the layout. A few years ago, this was a double track, and R.C. Williams was in this portion of the layout. And it's not that I didn't like it, but I thought it could be better. And I just really liked the idea of a collection of old industrial buildings that created kind of a scene block between the two ends of the layout where crews are working. And I've always liked the scene of an urban single track running along a river and old industrial buildings, and that's what influenced this layout. Part of my goal with the layout is to represent city life, and alleys were a part of city life. So here along the edge of the Hudson River is an alley that goes back to a street with some garbage and some trash and a truck and some guys talking, and that would be a typical scene on a back street in the city. We're looking here at an elevated section of the railroad, and the Spear Furniture Warehouse is prototypical. There was a Spear Furniture Warehouse along the High Line. The Towers warehouses, there are a number of Towers warehouses, and this billboard on the side of the building is actually still visible if you walk the High Line. And in the left of the shot is the Merchants Warehouse. In real life, it was the Merchants Refrigerating Company, and it was one of 2 very large cold storage warehouses along the High Line. And this is Nabisco, the National Biscuit Company, and the New York Central High Line actually did serve Nabisco, and it's one of the major customers on the layout. And I've kind of divided it in half. On the left side with the 2 Buffalo Creek boxcars is where Nabisco receives flour and occasionally sugar and sometimes boxes. And then on the right side with the Jade Green New York Central car is Nabisco Shipping. And our operators provide empties for Nabisco to ship its wonderful products. In New York City on the west side of Manhattan was the meatpacking district, and Swift and Cudahy and Armour all had facilities there, but I've combined them into one and named it the New York Meat Terminal. But we do have Swift cars and Cudahy cars and Armour cars all coming from the west, mostly around Chicago, Joliet, Illinois, and delivered here to the west side of Manhattan. In the left side of the photo is Washington Street Yard, and that's kind of an off-spot yard. The way I think of operations, the overnight crew delivered some cars here to be delivered to customers down here on the west side, the lower west side of Manhattan. And when we start an operating session, these cars are waiting their turn to be switched, and the operating crew will then take them and deliver them to nearby industries. This is St. John's Park Terminal, and on the prototype, this was the end of the line on the west side of Manhattan, and at one point it was the end of the line on this layout until I expanded. And for a variety of reasons, I just wasn't a fan of how it operated. The track arrangement was a little bit different than it is now, but I decided to leave the building in place in this corner of the layout with an abandoned track, just to help sort of create the city scene. Again, we're in the mid-1960s, and there was a lot of change going on in New York at that time, and a number of old buildings, both industries and old tenement apartment buildings, were either already raised or being raised or were abandoned, and this is kind of a representation of that. So here we're looking at Empire Beverage in the foreground, and that's a proto-freelance customer here. And it receives a variety of beverages, including Coca-Cola products. And in the background we have the Union Freight Terminal, which is a furniture warehouse, and we get furniture from all around the country here to be delivered to Manhattan. Here we're looking at another corner of the layout. This is Pier 17 along the Hudson River, and that actually was a pier used by New York Central. And we have the New York Central covered barges there, which the Central's covered barges and those of other railroads used to be plentiful in New York Harbor into the 1960s. We're kind of at the tail end of that era with the layout, but I like the looks of them and I wanted them on my waterfront. A little bit closer we have Atlantic Seafood, which is switched by the crew that works this end of the layout. Usually Atlantic Seafood receives empty refrigerator cars to put some fish in that was just delivered by that boat right in front of the covered barge. This is Hudson Cement, again a proto-freelance part of the layout, and gives me the opportunity to introduce some cement hoppers into operation. This kind of cement dealer was often found along waterfront, so I felt like it was a natural fit, even though I don't believe there was one on the west side of Manhattan for the New York Central. We're looking at Austin Nichols, which I've included a rail that went into the building that's no longer in use, so we have an abandoned rail. Austin Nichols was in fact a grocery dealer, but in Brooklyn, not in Manhattan, and it was a very large customer along the East River, and I just needed a nice low building here and something that sort of felt at home in New York City, so I've included it here, and but made it not rail served, but made it formerly rail served. Looking at Baker Williams on the west side of Manhattan for the first more than half of the 20th century, there were at least a half dozen Baker Williams warehouses, so we had to include one here. And now we're at the Riverside Food Terminal, which is the end of the line on my Manhattan Terminal Railroad. And this is representing an operation that was in 30th Street Yard, where there were numerous tracks, far more than the ones I have here, of refrigerator cars and some box cars that delivered produce and food and all kinds of things, and trucks backed in on driveways and pulled right up to the cars, and I needed to represent that here, and it's one of the major switching areas for the operating crew on this end of the layout.
On my new layout, I am building all of the track from scratch using Fast Track's fixtures and tools. Turnouts, crossovers, and all of the track in between. The crossovers for my Wyoming Valley Railroad are single crossovers, like the ones shown in this photo by Roger Puda. When I searched for instructions on building a single crossover on the Fast Track's website, I found this notation stating, "We currently do not have documentation about building single crossovers with these fixtures. However, the techniques used are similar to building double crossovers." The website also states crossovers are constructed by building two symmetrical halves of a crossover in the assembly fixture and then joining them to form a complete double crossover. While you can build single crossovers using the same procedures as a double crossover, I built my single crossovers a little differently. Hello, my name is Chuck Diljak of the Garden State Division, and in this NERx Tips and Tricks segment, I will cover how I built single crossovers for my layout using Fast Track's fixtures. This is a photo of the crossover I had on my old layout and used to meet one of the requirements for the Achievement Program for Model Railroad Engineer Civil. While the crossover was functional, I never really liked it. The first reason I didn't like this crossover was a functional issue. I ended up with small sections of rail after cutting gaps for the frogs, and I needed small sections of rail to connect one turnout to the other in the crossover. I prefer one strip of rail except for the gap needed for the frog in order to prevent future issues. And the second reason is a more cosmetic one, where the ties for both turnouts needed to be intertwined. When you look at the crossover template on the Fast Track's website, it has ties that span both turnouts. It looks right. But what about the functional issue? I'll show you how I avoided that in this video. But first, I had to buy the double crossover fixture from Fast Track's, which can be used to build double crossovers, single crossovers in either direction, or even a single turnout. So it is a very versatile fixture, eliminating the need for a fixture used for building individual turnouts. To start, let's look at two templates from the Fast Track's website. The top one is a double crossover, and a single crossover is on the bottom. Fast Track's also has instructions on building a double crossover on its website, and as noted earlier, you make everything shown in the top template as one component. You construct two of them before joining them in the center. But is this how you should build the single crossover shown at the bottom? Let's take a look at the differences in the template to help answer that question. The double crossover has additional frogs in the center where the stock rails from each of the turnouts cross each other. These frogs need to be isolated, just like the frog of a simple turnout. Therefore, gaps need to be cut. However, when you look at the stock rail that crosses from one track to the other in the single crossover, there isn't a need for gaps since there isn't a frog in the center. Instead, the stock rail continues ungapped to the frog of the turnout for the top rail. The frog of the top turnout is the stock rail for the bottom turnout. The only gaps needed are the same gaps that are cut for a regular turnout to isolate the frog. These gaps are cut in the final steps in the construction of a turnout, just like a regular turnout. So if there aren't any gaps in the stock rail leading to the frog, you can still build two symmetrical turnouts. But instead of being two halves as shown in the Fast Track's template, build two where the frog of a turnout will later become the stock rail of the other as shown here. This is how I eliminated those short sections of rail. I built two turnouts following the steps that Fast Track's advises, only I did not install the stock rail and the guardrail for the diverging route. Now I have two symmetrical turnouts, and you can see that the frog has a rail that will become the stock rail of the other turnout. Lining them up like this, you can see how they will get joined. To join them, you will need the Fast Track's jig again. Line them up so that there is enough space between the two turnouts at the end of the jig to insert another printed circuit board tie as shown in the single crossover template. Mark the stock rail for where you need to file it using the stockade. Swap the turnouts and mark the other stock rail for where it needs to be filed with the stockade. Then file both stock rails. Insert additional PCB ties for the normal route. Insert the two turnouts, again leaving space for an additional PCB tie that separates the two halves, and solder together except for the point rail. Then install the final guardrail and use the NMRA gauge to check the flangeway and no-go. Swap the turnouts and repeat these steps. Remove the crossover from the fixture and solder the other point rail for both turnouts. Also, install the PCB tie that is at the midpoint of the entire assembly. Don't forget to flip the assembly over and run a little solder between the frog and the tie. With all of that done, now you can cut the gaps for the frog. I held my crossover assembly in a panavise with vinyl jaws while carefully cutting the gaps with a jeweler saw. Once that is done, check everything with the NMRA gauge, and use a meter to check for continuity and make sure all of the rails are isolated where they need to be. And that's it. Now on with the show.
Welcome back to the show here. Thank you to Chuck Diljak for that tip on Fast Track's single crossovers. We're going to move right on to our next clinic, which is by Dennis Colucci. Dennis is a 23-year-old N-scale modeler. He has a proto-freelance railroad and also models the New Haven. Good for you, Dennis. All the best people model the New Haven. He focuses on modeling the New Haven Maybrook line and specializes in weathering. He's also an Eagle Scout and has an architecture degree from RPI. Dennis, what would you like to tell us here?
Yeah, so I've been weathering cars pretty much since I got into the hobby just over a decade ago. And, you know, I've started sharing my expertise, whether it be through the NMRA stuff at clinics like this or on my YouTube channel and stuff. So I figured might as well, you know, share what I know. So made a video of weathering this Santa Fe Boxcar, and we'll take you through the process. So Speed, go ahead and roll the tape. Hey y'all, my name is Dennis Colucci, and today I'm going to teach you how I do weathering on steel-sided freight cars, especially box cars. So a lot of these techniques can be used on just about any steel-sided car. I'm just going to be applying them on a box car, but a lot of the techniques are the same across basically all steel-sided cars. It's just a matter of where you apply the techniques and how much you apply them. So we're going to be weathering this Santa Fe 50-foot shock and roll boxcar as a demonstration. I've already gone ahead and sealed it because I put the decal on there for the ACI label, as you can see below the L there. But before we get into starting the actual weathering process, I want to go ahead and take you through some of the items that I use, some of the materials I use. So, first thing is I use a multimedia approach to weathering. I use oil paints, acrylic paints, panel liner, and weathering powders, all on the same piece of rolling stock. And what I really like about that is it gives me a quite varied effect on the rail car. It allows me to get the best of all of the different techniques without necessarily having to sacrifice anything other than time. My technique does typically take a couple hours to a few hours per car, if not longer, depending on how heavy you work with the oil paints, because oil paints cure, and they do so over a longer period of time when they're thicker, as opposed to acrylic paints, which dry. So going through my list of materials here, you're going to want some paint brushes, some wide, some thin, and some soft and round. You are going to want a palette to put your paints in, along with some water for the acrylic paints. You are going to want some titanium white oil paint, and I've just got some Winsor and Newton, titanium white. You are going to want some dark brown oil paint. I have Winsor and Newton Van Dyke brown, but any dark brown will do. As far as the acrylic paints, I have a red brown. This is Folk Art Red Clay, but any kind of reddish brownish color will do. You're going to want a medium brown. This is the Apple Barrel Brown Oxide. And you're going to want a orange. This is just orange from the Hobby Lobby Crafters collection. I use the Tamiya panel liner. This is the dark brown one. This is typically what I use, but you can also use other colors if you want to get different effects. I'm going to be using the dark brown to get some grime and rust. you are going to want, and then you're going to want some powders. So I here have Bragg Enterprises weather system powders. I have the dark rust, the light rust, and the old Tuscan for dark rust, light rust, and grime/dirt, respectively. All of those can be found online, but you can also create your own weathering powder by getting some artists' pastel sticks and shaving them down with an X-Acto or some other blade into a fine powder. It will not adhere quite as well because you won't get quite as fine of a powder, but it works almost as well. And the last thing that you might want is some thinner. This is odorless paint thinner, mineral spirits basically, to help you clean your brushes from the oil paints. The water should be plenty to clean your brushes from the acrylic paints, but the thinner will help you a lot when cleaning from the oil paints. And I believe that is all the materials that you will need. So we're going to go ahead and get started by stepping into the first part of the weathering process for me, which in my case is almost always finding a prototype photo to base your work on. Okay, so like I said, the first step that I always do is look for a reference image. So I use railroadpicturearchives.net as my reference image finder. It's a very good website that allows you to get all sorts of prototype images. So I usually go to, if I know the specific road number, I'll search for that road number, or if I don't find any pictures of the specific road number, I will go ahead and look up the car type and the railroad, and then I will scroll through until I find either similar road numbers or similar looking cars. So since I have a super shock control 50-foot boxcar, I'm going to choose this one. It's not exactly the same, and I believe that's because the model here is not actually correct for the car series. This car has riveted sides. The car that I have here to weather has actual structural struts down the side. It's ribbed. So I'm not going to get anything exactly the same, but this is very close. It has all the same style of graphics. The only thing that's missing for my car does not have the SL in the corner. So other than that, though, basically all the graphics are the same. And since I'm model 75 to 85, the date here is within my modeling range. And of course, this is Stephen Vincent's photo, so giving him credit. But we are going to use this as our reference photo for the weathering work we are going to do. And like I said, it's very easy to use railroadpicturesarchives.com. All you need to do is when you get to the website, go to the top corner here and you can search by railroad. If you're looking for a locomotive, you can search by locomotive model, or you can just go to the search bar and type in whatever you need. Very easy to use, and we are going to use this Stephen Vincent photo for my reference photo. Okay, so the first step in the process here is using the oil paint to fade the car. Now, my prototype photo doesn't have a ton of fading. However, it does have some very particular fading above the boxcar door, the very top of the boxcar's door, and along the top edge, as well as, I presume, on the black roof. So, I'm going to go ahead and take my wider brush here, and pick up some of this oil paint, and we're basically going to go ahead and dry brush this oil paint onto the side of the car to get the whole car faded, and then go in and do a little heavier coat where I need it in particular. But the general technique is simple dry brush. As I was saying, the general technique is to basically just dry brush some of this white oil paint across the entire car and use the brush to just work the paint into a nice, thin, even coat. if you have any, a foam brush is excellent for really working the paint in. I know I didn't mention that in my materials list, but it's very helpful in really just working this oil paint into a nice, even coat. If you have a little too much oil paint on there, you can always take a paper towel and simply wipe. You can occasionally, if you need, give a very light dip of your paper towel into some thinner. Dab off a lot of what you get on there so that it's fairly dry. And then simply work the paint off the model to lighten up how much paint is on there. And then go back to working the paint onto the model. So this right here is a pretty good representation of what you should be looking for. Basically, just enough paint on the model to lighten the existing color. In this case, from a bright red to a softer, duller red. Go ahead and put a little bit more paint on here. Work it in. Work it until you're happy. So that's pretty good for me. So now, like I said, there are a couple areas that are a little more faded on my prototype, including right at the very top of the door here, and generally along the very top edge of the car, but especially right at the top of the door there. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that to my model. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and work myself all the way around this car, and I'll show a quick time lapse of me doing that. But I'm going to continue to apply the same technique all the way around the car until I am satisfied with what I've got. So I'll go ahead and get that done and be right back. Okay, so as you can see here now, I've gone ahead and blended in all of the oil paint. So now we have a nice faded boxcar, which is fairly similar to the level of fading on the prototype photo I was looking at. I might go in and put a little bit more fading on the top of the car, but what we're going to go ahead and do now is move on to the next step. Okay, so our next step is to work on getting some light rust paint mixed up and put onto the rail car here. So what I'm going to do is take some of my orange acrylic, squirt some into my palette. Don't need a ton, just a small dollop here. Okay, so now that we've got a small dollop of orange paint here, we're going to get a roughly similar sized dollop of my brown oxide brown acrylic. And we're going to go ahead and mix these together. Okay, so now that we've got some orange and some brown paint, we're going to go ahead and mix it up. So I'm going to grab a brush here and just blend these together. And what we're looking for is an orange brown, an orangish brown, like the color of light flaky rust. Similar to this here. This is pretty good. At this point, if you're not satisfied with the color, you can always go ahead and add a touch more brown, a touch more orange, or even if you need a touch of black to build it in. Here's also where, if you so desire, you can take your red brown, in my case the terracotta red clay here, and add just a drop of this in to bring it to a little bit more of a red rust as opposed to a brown rust. So I'm going to put just a drop of this in here. That's actually even too much. So I'm going to go ahead and scoop some of that out and just deposit it in the next well over. Now I'm going to blend this in. And you can see we get a slightly redder color. So that there is pretty good. We're going to stick with that. Wipe off the brush, make sure I get all of the excess paint off, and rinse it in my water here. So now that we have our red rust color, we're going to start to apply it. And where I'm going to apply it, according to my prototype photo, is roughly on, well, in the prototype photo, it's on the rivet lines. On this, it's going to be on the structural ribs. I'm going to go in on the Boxcar here with one of my thinner brushes. We'll go with this guy here. Move this out of the way so you can actually see as I'm working. I'm going to go in with my red, brown, orange rust mix. And we're going to just kind of put a light base color on some of these spars. Now, this is going to be relatively hard to see on this car because it's a redder car. I'm going to hit the raised gear on the door. I'm going to put a couple of streaks. I'm going to put a couple streaks down from the roof. So put a streak right here. And make sure it's really pulled down the side of the car. You can see the shiny there. I'll go right onto the edge of where the door rail is. Pull down. You can see the streak right here. Put a couple of specks in on the side of the car, especially on the logo here, because the logo here on my prototype photo has a good amount of peeling and rust spots. So if you have a brush that has fine bristles, fine point bristles, but they're a little bit futzed, this is a good job for that, to add a little bit of randomness. Alternatively, you can use a sponge brush that's been kind of torn up a little bit. You tear the tip off of the sponge brush. You could use that torn bit of brush to get a similar random pattern. But just little specks of rust, basically. Places where rust has started to take control. I'm also going to put the rust down here on the bottom edge of the car, where pieces of ballast and crud along the rail line will get picked up and chip away at the paint at the bottom of the car, exposing the metal to the air and the elements, allowing it to oxidize. So that's the side there. I'm going to work my way all the way around, but before I do so, I'm going to show you a little bit of what I do on the roof as well, and then we will get all of the paint done here with the acrylics. It's important to try and let the oil paint set a little bit before you get to work, but with the roof, I go into the corners and along the edges here, and just make some little pockets of rust. Some little specks along the edge here. Really just catching that edge and maybe a little further in. And don't mind if it looks a little sloppy. We're going to go in and add more layers on top, and that'll hide a little bit of the slop. Then I'm also going to go ahead and all of these roof spars, all of these raised spots and kind of coming down from them, as well as down from the ridge line of the car. Now it's important to not overdo the rust. It's very easy to overdo the rust, especially at this stage. So you still want to try and maintain a little bit of restraint. Don't be afraid to wipe off a little paint as you work if you think there's just a little too much. So I'm going to continue all the way around the car here, getting to work on the sides and the roof. So continuing on to the ends here, where I'm going to get tops of all of these end beams, and right on this rivet line in here, really picking up some of that rivet detail, and just generally continuing around the car, picking up all these raised areas as well as adding some streaks. And this is where looking at a number of prototype photos is really going to help you, because while your specific prototype photo may not show a specific part of the car, having looked at multiple prototype photos, you can infer what things will look like, or you can look at other prototype photos and decide, well, it's not exactly what this prototype photo shows, but I like that effect a little better, so you can try that. So I'm going to work my way around on the time-lapse and get this done, and we will come back and show the results and move on to the next step. Okay, so next step here is to go ahead and take my brown oil paint. This is, again, the Winsor & Newton Winton oil color Van Dyke brown that I'm using, but you can use any kind of, you know, dark brown, whether that's a burnt umber or whatever. I'm just going to put a little bit here in my palette. And now I'm going to take my fine point brush here, pick up a little bit right on the tip. And go to work on the car. Okay, so I'm going to take my brush that has some of this right on the tip here. And I'm going to go ahead and start on the sides here. And for my ribs, I'm going to carefully just catch the very tip, very edge, frontmost edge of these ribs. Right on top of the light brown rust that I've already put down. And it's okay that it's going on a little patchy. Basically what we're simulating here is the spots where the rust is actually originating from. So I'm just trying to catch all these exposed edges here. So I'm going to go all of these ribs right on the edges. And if you have a car with rivets, you can catch just the rivet heads. So if I jump to the car end here, I catch just the tips of the rivets here. And that will get you that same effect. And same thing here on the side. If I just carefully and lightly brush, I can just catch the very heads of those rivets right here. The other thing I'm going to do is all of these rust spots on the side, right towards the top of the rust spot. I'm going to go ahead and fill in a little bit of my oil paint. And I'm also going to go ahead and add a couple of extra spots. And using a foam brush. And draw some of that paint down. And again, just draw these oil splotches down, creating some nice streaks. So I'm going to work my way around the car and do that. But before I do that, I want to talk about how I work on the roof as well before we jump into that. So for the roof, in these corner patches and patches that I have like this, I'm kind of generally filling in the very corner. There you go. Right on the very edge. And right along the very edge of the ridge of the roof here. So if I take my finer point brush, and on these over here, I'm going to go right at the very edge of the car. Continue along the ridge here, and just generally towards the top of any of these streaks, put some of this oil paint, and along the kind of edges here. just put some of this. And you'll see as I work on it in the time lapse here, some more of specifically where I put it. But this is the general idea. And if I have a little too heavy in any given spot, I can again take that foam brush and pull it either direction down the side of the car to add a little streaking. So I'm going to work my way around the car on the roof and the ends, get that done, and we will get that done. I'll show you the results, and we will move on to what I do as my final step, which is the powders. Okay, so we've gone ahead and gotten all of the oil work done here. So as you can see, we got some nice streaks and some nice dark spots going, and it really kind of brings the car to life, adds a bunch of character to it. And I will admit my roof is a little bit sloppy, but not too bad. On the car ends, you can see I put it right at the top half of those cross beams, and on the side again, tops of streaks, and all the way around along the edge of the roof. So overall, fairly good. So now you're going to let that cure for half an hour or so, and then we'll circle back to do our we're gonna let that you're gonna let that cure for about an hour, half an hour. You're gonna let that cure for about half an hour, 30-40 minutes or so, and then we'll circle back and do our powder weathering. But before we do that, we're gonna work on the trucks here. So the trucks are actually fairly easy, and we're gonna start working with the powders here. So I'm gonna take my dark rust color with a second fine brush here, one that doesn't have paint on it at the moment. Take a little bit of the powder, load it up on my brush, like so. And I'm going to focus right in on the springs here. Fill in that spring area on all four sides of the trucks here. Blow them clear, and that adds a little spike of color. Now what I'm going to do is pick up a little bit of my light rust powder, and go ahead and give just a dusting across the entire truck. Just to brighten the truck up, so you can see the difference between this truck here and that truck there. So we're going to do it again over here. Dusting over the whole thing. Pick up a little bit more. And one final truck. And there we have 4 nicely faded and slightly rusted trucks. So now that that's done, we'll let the oil paint cure, and we will circle back once that is done. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to the last major step here, which is using the weathering powders. So I'm going to start off with the Old Tuscan, or basically a dark brown weathering powder if you have other brands or if you mixed your own. So I'm going to load up a nice soft brush with this dark brown. And I'm going to hit just the whole bottom half of the car with a good coating of this powder. Just continuing all the way across the car, giving it a nice dirty appearance on the lower half of the car. Now, if you're sensitive to dust, this is a good time to put on a face mask, because especially if you're using the Spragdon powders or other dedicated weathering powders, they tend to be very fine particulate, and you can see a lot of the powder just blowing off of this. So be careful if you have respiratory issues or are sensitive to dust in the air to keep yourself safe. So now that I've got a nice layer of brown across the bottom, I'm going to bring some up around the car ends, around the door. And move around to the side. Now for this, I want to use the same brush to get, generally the bottom of the car hit with the same kind of technique, same application. And then I'm going to take my fine brush and go ahead and give a couple of vertical streaks of dirt roughly in line with the wheel sets. And of course, this is because as the boxcar rolls, the wheel sets kick up dirt and shoot it up the side of the car. So there we go. Move around to the other side of the car. Same application all the way across. Again, pulling it up around the sides, a little bit around the handles on the door. But otherwise, just giving a nice, even application across the side of the car. And the same deal on the end as the other end. Straight across. On the bottom. Bringing in the fine brush. To get a couple streaks of dirt coming up from where the wheels would kick up the dirt. Just like so. All right. So now that we're done with the Old Tuscan. Actually, before we're done with the Old Tuscan, I nearly forgot to hit the bottom of the car. This dark brown is perfect for doing all the undercarriage detail. And generally, in this case, killing some of that shiny black paint. Or in this case, metallic black, because it's blackened metal, since this is an old Concours car. So just a coat of this across will kill some of that shine and give your undercarriage a much more used appearance for all you'll see of it. As well as generally having it match the rest of the sides of the car. So now I'm going to put this away move on to the light rust. So for these other ones, I'm going to use more of my finer brushes some more. So I'm going to use the light rust color here, and I'm going to use my slightly wider fine brush. Go ahead and load it up. Some powder. And now, over all the areas that I put my rust paint, I'm going to kind of spread, streaking down from there, this light rust powder. Now, we're not trying to hide the paint. We are trying to simply enhance it. So, you may need to use your finger or a foam brush or a clean brush to kind of pull some of that off and away. So I'm just going to continue all the way across here, pulling some of it down, just building in some more variety of color into my rust, as well as softening a lot of those edges. And the light rust here allows us to really kind of give some character to the rest of the roof that was just a faded black earlier in the weathering process. So there we have it. Now on the sides, we're just going to go around and do some more of the same. All the spots where there is rust, especially the streaks, we're going to use the light rust to pull streaks down from all of these rust spots. Starting underneath and kind of pulling down. Like so. So I'm going to continue all the way around the rest of the car and do this. That way you can save a little bit of time here. So I'll jump to a time lapse and be right back to finish this up. All right, so now that we are done using the light rust, we're going to jump to the dark rust, and we're going to do something very similar. Although generally we're going to be a little more light-handed about it. So I'm going to take my finest brush again. Go ahead and load up just a little bit on the tip. And starting on the roof here, we're going to go ahead and just run right down the center, just the lightest bit to bring a little more color back through the light rust